Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Amber Nightingale Sultani, the Associate State Director for AARP here in Northern Virginia. I want to welcome you on behalf of AARP. We are thrilled to be collaborating with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University to bring our members just a sampling of the rich programs that they offer on the regular basis. From our earliest beginnings, AARP has been a champion of lifelong learning. Our founder, Dr. Ethel Percy Andrews, once said, quote, "The eagerness to learn, to pioneer in the development of new skills and new abilities, to broaden the personal scopes of understanding, to freshen the mind with new ideas and new concepts, to achieve new heights of knowledge, has no age restriction." Those words are true today, just as they were when she said them in the 1950s. Studies have shown that challenging your brain in new ways throughout life may strengthen your brain, and our brain is stimulated and makes new connections when we learn new things or pursue new interest. So AARP encourages you to stay curious and give yourself a good mental workout by doing something that not only challenges your thinking, offers you enjoyment, but also encourages you to grapple with new and complex ideas. So we thank you for joining us this morning and hope you enjoy this lecture. And now I will turn it to Jennifer Desano, the Executive Director of Ali Mason.
Thank you so much, Amber, and thank you, Dallas, for your efforts today. The Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University has been in existence for 30 years. We serve curious individuals who participate in lectures, clubs, trips, and special events, as well as volunteer opportunities such as teaching and service on committees. There are many things you can learn and do at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University. And I want to welcome all of our Ali Mason members, as well as those of you who are in Virginia and across the United States online through our AARP connection. You can learn more about Ali at olli.gmu.edu. And we are very happy to be collaborating to bring our wonderful speaker today. Mark Royce is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Northern Virginia Community College and author of The Political Theology of European Integration, Comparing the Influence of Religious Histories on European Policies. Please welcome Mark Royce.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, Amber, for that cordial introduction. And it's a privilege to join all of you this morning for my talk. And at 171 participants and 72 participants, excuse me, and counting, clearly we are a large extended family this morning. So again, thank you. Give me just one moment to share my screen, and we'll begin. You should be seeing my slides at this moment.
Yes, that's correct.
Good, thank you. My name is Mark Royce. I am Assistant Professor of Political Science at Northern Virginia Community College on the Annandale campus. My job, or rather my calling, as it were, my mission, is to teach international relations and comparative politics courses to the undergraduates. So what I do, either face-to-face or last year online, is to take students through what I try to think of as a kind of an odyssey through the structure of the international system, the forms of control and of order that it exudes, as well as through different countries and political cultures across the world. So I do this for a living, and I'm happy to share just 1 hour of that or so with all of you. I've also become, I think, as proficient as anyone I know in the art of Zooming. Over the last year and a half, I've been teaching these classes since spring break of 2020, when we didn't return, as it were. I've been teaching them here at Zoom online. So I've developed some proficiency at this and should get to look forward to a time that we have together. And I give you political religion, the first 100 years. We have all seen, we have all on this call experienced, I think especially those of riper years, shall we say, the apparent extremism that has taken hold of our political system and of other systems as well in Europe and abroad. And perhaps what we see and feel around us is not merely Republicans and Democrats or conservatives and liberals being more angry at one another than ever before, although I think there is that, but something deeper as well. Deeper struggles for identity, for belonging, for what it does or does not mean to inhabit a liberal order at a democratic state, and at what cost all of this is to be preserved. And so the subject of political religion is very timely. It's not merely something that belongs to the history of the 20th century. It's something that has reappeared forcefully, violently, and to serve as a very useful and challenging point of discussion. So let us begin together, go forward together. Political thought in this country, USA, was relatively stagnant through the Second World War. If you, as many of you, some of you probably did, attend university prior to World War II, and if you were interested in politics, you would sort of show up there and you would read these classic authors from ancient Athens, read Plato, read Aristotle, from the modern period, Machiavelli, Hobbes, and then through to the Enlightenment that shaped our own constitution and political culture. And there's certainly nothing wrong with any of this. And many of the instructors, the faculty at that time, became legendary teaching faculty in terms of how they opened the minds of young people to these issues and built it up further. Well, following World War II, there was a massive infusion of political thought coming into the universities in the United States that really established the foundations of how we think about politics today, with some brilliant scholarship. Names such as Hannah Arendt, Hans Morgenthau, Henry Kissinger, or in this case, Eric Voglin. These intellectuals characteristically were European, especially German Jewish, who, fleeing the Third Reich, found their way here. And they enormously enriched the way we think about political thought through their teaching and through their research. And it's important not to overgeneralize, obviously. Henry Kissinger is not Hans Kelsen. Hannah Arendt was not Eric Voglin, but in very general terms, these immigrant intellectuals, above all German Jewish, they took politics very, very seriously. If one of the prevailing tendencies within our political thought at that time was to view politics as kind of a joke, right? You know, British Parliament and their heckling one another and indulging in irony and sallies of wit, or in our political system where political campaigns and candidates make fun of one another and draw political cartoons, and it's all kind of a spectator sport. No, 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 not so for these intellectuals who had fled from Hitler, who had experienced the persecution, who observed World War II and the Holocaust. For them, the political was mortally serious, that nothing was more important than achieving a new kind of politics based on human dignity and respect, that politics and political breakdown is no joking matter. And needless to say, that reflected their biographies. So as they came to the United States and set up shop teaching in the universities, many of these European intellectuals, as it were, processed their trauma and created some of the jewels by which political science is read and understood today. And one of them was Erich Voglin, who began his career as professor at the University of Vienna, who in 1938, with the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, fled to the United States along with his wife, teaches in the United States in various colleges and universities, beginning at Louisiana State, and wrote many books, wrote voluminously, that are now collected through the University of Missouri's series on Voglin. And so Professor Dr. Voglin wrote many books and essays, but The Political Religions of 1938 is maybe his most famous essay. It's not a long work, it's maybe 80 or 90 pages, but there in The Political Religions, he furnishes perhaps his most famous formulation right at the heart of totalitarianism, whereby, in one sentence, the totalist movements of fascism, Nazism, Bolshevism, and others politicize religion in the sense that much of their power derives from secularizing theological concepts, that these total political movements provide the embeddedness, the sort of culture, the sense of believing and belonging, and above all, of cosmic purpose that previously had been imparted by the Christian faith, messianic religions, but is now being made and transformed into secular religion. So in a sense, these are religious movements, not in terms of theology, but in terms of their political theology. And that is the source of their power, appealing to that spiritual purpose and longing within men and women. Here are a couple of thesis passages from the essay that I will read along with you, but that you can kind of think of here to get a sense of Voglin's thesis. The Christian apocalypse of the empire, the first of these, and the symbolism of the late Middle Ages form the historical basis for the apocalyptic dynamics in modern political religions. The symbolism of the apocalypse of the empires lives on in the symbolism of the three empires of Marx and Engels' philosophy of history, in the Third Reich of National Socialism, and in the fascist Third Rome. So as different as these totalitarian movements are ideologically, something unites them. And what unites them is that notion of political religion. More broadly, the life of people in political community cannot be defined as a profane realm in which we are concerned only with legal questions and the organization of power. A community is also a realm of religious order, for humans live in political society with all traits of their being, from the physical to the spiritual and religious traits. The political community is always integrated in the overall context of human experience, of world and God. You could apply that, for example, to our own Constitution of 1789. Article 1, legislative branch, Article 2, executive, Article 3, judicial, and then the amendments. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a nice, balanced instrument of government, but it ignores ultimate authority. It ignores man. It ignores nature. It ignores longing for transcendent reality. Being a masterpiece of liberalism, that's what it does. This is the law. This is how it works. And that's not in error. It's just perhaps insufficient in Voglin's reading. We are creatures of flesh and blood. We're spiritual creatures, and we long for that sense of cosmic purpose and of embeddedness. And if liberalism fails to supply it, then the totalitarian movements will as well. Beginning in chronological order with Bolshevism. So we are proceeding through how a political science book essay would normally be constructed. Normally at the beginning of these kinds of works, you sort of outline your theory. These are the ideas. This is the thesis that'll be pursued. And then you move through your different cases, as it were. So that's what we're doing. Voglin, in his essay, provides us the idea, and now we're going to pursue it through these various cases, beginning with Bolshevism. Voglin writes, political collectivism is not only a political and moral phenomenon. To me, its religious elements seem much more significant. Vladimir Ilyich, party name Lenin, was atheist, along with the rest of the communist leadership in the Soviet Union. There is no God. But he was also one of the most brilliant theorists and practitioners of revolution in terms of founding the Soviet Union. Here he is in a Soviet portrait of himself standing tall and valiant, the red banner fluttering to his side, in terms of how the Soviet Union was created. When the Bolsheviks took power in Petrograd in 1917, they established the world's first communist government in accordance with the theory of historical materialism. And that theory is central to Voglin's understanding of totalitarianism from a Soviet poster of that era, May Day at that time. Marx and Engels were German English radicals who were writing in mid to late Victorian Britain, the same milieu, as it were, from which you derive, we read the novels such as Dickens' Oliver Twist or Hard Times, Gaskell's North and South, about the Industrial Revolution, about the dark satanic mills, to quote William Blake, that are being populated over the English countryside, the filth and grime, the lives destroyed, tremendous damage to human and natural ecology, little boys covered in soot, little girls working in the coal mines, these horrors of industrial revolution that we read about in the novels and which troubled the Victorian conscience were made into a social theory by Marx and Engels. Most fully developed in Marx's Das Kapital, and then most famously applied in the Communist Manifesto. The substance of the theory is the following. Struggles between different social classes drive history. Class defined not as an earl versus a duke, but as position within productive process. So the Roman Empire, the landlord class, the patricians, and then you had the ordinary people. Middle Ages, feudalism, hierarchy. Renaissance, Reformation, the burghers, the cities, buying and selling, trading, things happening, okay? And now moving up to the 19th century under the reign of capitalism, or capital. Marx himself invented the very word. Adam Smith never uses the word capital or capitalism, wasn't invented. Marx comes up with it. And by capital, he means, best description, the surplus value by which the owners and operators of the great machines of the Industrial Revolution extract extra value or surplus value from the workers, the proletariat, the industrial army, the 99% who are doomed to work in the machine, to slave and suffer, so as to provide surplus value to the owners and the operators of capital. And thus there are two classes in our 19th century, the proletariat, the industrial army of the workers, and the bourgeoisie, the 1% who own and control the capital. But Marx and Engels write in their many books and articles that we can't go on like this, that this system of capital will eventually break down of its own accord, and that the proletariat here seen will arise and they will take power, beginning with the factories in which they are oppressed, and then proceeding to sort of the capital of the state, taking control of the cathedral, the public broadcasting service, the parliament, the presidential palace, throw the bums out, get rid of that 1%, and declare the dictatorship of the proletariat. The first and only official act of which will be the abolition of all property, and with it all forms of oppression, moving toward a communist society. And as fanciful as this theory, as I've just presented it, may seem, it served as the most compelling political idea of the 20th century, beginning with Lenin. He hated the Tsarist regime in Russia. His brother had been caught and killed by its secret police. He's in exile for a number of years, and then in 1917 he returns. And during that really miracle year, he publishes a number of books or pamphlets: The State and Revolution, What is to be Done, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, and above all, his greatest work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, which holds that as the capitalist countries seek for new markets in the third world, the result of it is imperialist wars and entanglements, a very parsimonious theory to explain hegemonic conflicts in the world. So Lenin is a genius at full stop. His written work is extremely impressive. And the reach and power of his mind really is awesome to behold. And in addition to being a theorist, he was also, of course, a revolutionary organizer who, it really wasn't that hard, summons the Bolshevik paramilitary. They take power in the Petrograd, they throw out the provisional government, and he creates the Soviet Union. Lenin was very disdainful of parliamentarism, of social democracy and socialism. He said that great issues are not decided by voting, but by class war. He was a true revolutionary. And he was placed in charge of a totalitarian state in Russia, in which the people had rights and liberties provided that they didn't conflict with what he wanted them to say or think or do. In that sense, Marxism-Leninism is pure political religion. It borrows much from, Engels actually admitted this, Christian theology in the notion of salvation in a world to come. But note the difference. Whereas in Christian theology, the salvation is to come in the next world, or at least with the final triumphant return of Christ into this world. In historical materialism, to quote Voglin, the eschaton is immanentized, meaning the final theological victory is brought into this world, and salvation comes from this world. Man makes his own salvation. The final victory is here, and we can achieve it ourselves. And so in that sense, Marxism-Leninism is a secular and atheist form, the strongest and most compelling form of political religion. Stalin added little to this except the shedding of a river of blood. He was not a brilliant theorist like those who came before him, nor was he a great warrior or orator or author like Trotsky. He was a bureaucrat, he was a party organizer, and really a coward in certain ways. But following Lenin's death, Stalin would succeed in murdering the entire Bolshevik leadership and transforming the Soviet Union into the planned economy and the totalist terror state based on mass intimidation and death and repression that we would then come to understand it in the Cold War. So when Ambassador Kennan eventually writes and authors the containment memo from 1946 and sends it back to Washington, here in Moscow. He is looking out over the Soviet Union that Stalin had made, and which in a sense was only strengthened and made more powerful by successfully defeating the Nazi invasion. Historical materialism is political religion, as Voglin understands it. But so also is fascism, a reactionary movement to the failures of liberal parliamentarism, to the terror of Bolshevism and communism, and to the feeling during the 1930s, not entirely without reason, that the liberal order and democracy proved itself too weak and too ineffectual to solve the problems that bedeviled the civilized world. Voglin writes, the theorists of the two radically inner-worldly ecclesia, the fascist Italian and the National Socialist German, draw from the common vocabulary of German Romanticism. Many of the organs of neoliberal opinion, Washington Post, New York Times, etc., sort of would lead one to believe that the only people who supported European fascism, as it were, fit the profile, right? Desperate, ignorant, nothing to lose, involuntarily celibate, racist, angry, anti-Semitic, etc. Well, many of them were involved in it, for sure. But that is not the sum total. In fact, it's maybe not even the majority. Fascism appealed to the elite of European society between the wars. Generals, admirals, professors. There's a long list of people with doctorates who supported the fascist movements. Professors, people with PhDs, physicians, lawyers, financiers, people actually with everything to lose and seemingly nothing to gain, nevertheless gravitated toward the fascist cause. And Voglin helps us understand why, the main why being that it's not merely a question of the failures of the Versailles Treaty or the Great Depression or the reparations in Germany, although all of that did apply. It was a search for more deeper meaning, for belonging, for a sense of community, for the importation of purpose, for a feeling of I'm a part of something important. The liberal order left little people atomized, angry, poor, in apartments, hopeless. Fascism comes along and says, you are somebody, we are somebody. Our nation and our cause and our Führer are engaged in this great struggle, and we are all comrades in arms. And that appealed to people. It gave a sense of community and of transcendent meaning that liberalism struggled, and I think still struggles, to articulate. Proceeding in order of power from Portugal under Dr. Salazar to Benito Mussolini in Italy, to Francisco Franco in Spain, and then we'll come to Nazism in its time. The first fascist regime to take power in Europe was the Italian. Benito Mussolini took or acquired near total control over Italy in 1926 with the Aventine secession in the parliament, whereby in protest of the rising tide of fascist violence, the other parties quit and folded, leaving Mussolini to acquire total control as prime minister. Mussolini began as a socialist on the part of the left, but he moves to the right because he felt, in part because he felt that the parliamentary order after the Great War was extremely disrespectful of the sacrifices of Italian war veterans, that it disdained them, that it belittled their concerns, that people disrespected, barely even knew of many of the sacrifices that had been made in the war in which Italy fought effectively, as a matter of fact. So Mussolini turns to the right as a way of galvanizing public support for a new kind of strong state with a modified free market system that he hoped to create in Italy. And in fact, actually, it really wasn't that hard. He takes over Milan, and then from there in the north, he then proceeds to the south. And thus, by about 1930, he is in total control, with the Catholic Church, the strongest stakeholder at that time, neutralized via the Lateran Pacts of 1929, whereby the Apostolic See would receive the Vatican City State as its own miniature state within international politics in exchange for remaining out of the political question and allowing Mussolini to proceed. This was a one-party state. Communists, trade unionists, Marxists, the left, feminists, atheists were imprisoned, including Antonio Gramsci. They were exiled. There were executions. And so this one-party state was built up on the basis of hyper-nationalism, militarism, and the cult of violence, the issuing of uniforms, the notion of collectivism of a conservative kind, that we are all comrades within the nation, a sort of centrally directed economic policy based on clientelism and the major industrialists within Italy. And then, of course, cultural conservatism, traditional gender roles, family work, and obedience. And what Mussolini achieved in Italy would serve to inspire and provide a template for the other fascists who would take control in Europe during the 1930s. In Portugal, Dr. Antonio Salazar built up the new state based on the church, the state, family, work, and obedience. Salazar began his career as a professor. He held a PhD in economics. He was the finance minister in Portugal. He becomes the foreign minister and the prime minister. And then with the acquiescence of the Portuguese army, he assumes total control. Here he renders the fascist salute, and the children, this says the book of first grade, so this is the first grade textbook in Salazar's Portugal, they render the fascist salute back. And for informational purposes only, of course, you still see this today. The open palm of the right hand is the salute of the authoritarian right, whereas the clenched fist of the left is socialism. And you still see this one in particular out on the streets today. We'll see the politics of the 1930s coming through. Salazar is less famous within the fascist world. He was more camera shy, as it were. He disdained mass rallies. He typically would just address the Portuguese people over the radio from behind the palace gates. He also did not issue uniforms, or at least wear them himself. He preferred simply civilian attire. So he was a more quiet version of this, but he would rule Portugal as a one-party police state in the name of Catholicism and obedience and conservatism until the 1970s. The fascist ideology in Spain was similar, but it required much greater violence in order to take power. The Portuguese and Spanish fascist dictatorships of the 1930s through the 70s certainly continued the logic and the doctrine of the Iberian Counter-Reformation. Ferdinand and Isabella, the Inquisition, Archbishop Cisneros, Cardinal Bellarmine, who wrote that it's really better for heretics to leave this world, and so on. That culture of violent theological intolerance, certainly manifested itself again in the fascist rulers of Spain and Portugal, but with this difference. The Spanish left-wing Republican government had taken power in 1931, and the result of this was the institution of the most left-wing political culture that had ever existed under the Spanish Republic. They did abortion on demand. They did governance through the trade unions, disestablishment of the church, expropriation of all of their wealth, murder of priests. They did civil marriage, firearms training for women so they can shoot men, cultural Marxism of all kinds. You don't get left of the Spanish left, or if so, you're with Columbus and you fall off the edge of the earth. Hyper left, hard Marxist. Well, as a result of all of these changes that the Spanish Republic was attempting to institute in the 1930s, the government basically lost control. And the army mutinied, the best word to describe it. And under General Francisco Franco, in 1936, the mutiny of the Spanish army would see the Spanish army fight against the Republic and its international brigade allies from the left for the future of Spain. Said another way, this was the most violent collision, I think, within the entirety of international history, between a secular left and a religious right in terms of the Spanish Civil War. On the side of the left, you had the Spanish Republic and its allies, the international brigades, anarchist movements, the independent communities in Spain, especially the Basques and the Catalans. And then on the right, you had the Phalangists, as they were called. That was the army. And the army eventually won, maybe unsurprising. The left fought as valiantly as it could, but ultimately the Phalangist forces, the Spanish right, was able to enter Madrid in 1939. And then Franco initially embarks upon a reign of terror and of retribution that would see the Spanish left utterly extirpated. All of the Marxists, feminists, trade unionists, atheists who had not already fled or taken their own lives were thrown into prison or executed in a mass purge. And then for the next 3 decades or more, Franco would rule with an iron fist, imposing Roman Catholic uniformity over Spain. But what is central to Voglin's doctrine here is that this is not merely the work of the dictators. This sense of community, the sense of fundamental values that we believe in that ensured the temporary triumph of fascism, until of course destroyed by the Allies, reflected people's deepest belongings for community and for purpose in their lives. A solemn warning to our embattled liberal tradition today. From this poster here of Franco's victory, La guerra ha terminado, the war has ended, and the new reign of peace has begun. Nazism. The strongest of all of these forms of political religion for Voglin, the most violent, the most effective, at least insofar as appealing to the German race and nation. Voglin continues in his essay, the Führer, or leader, is the point where the spirit of the people breaks into historical reality. The inner-worldly God speaks to the Führer in the same way the transcendent God speaks to Abraham. And the Führer transforms God's words into commands for his immediate followers and for the people. And the Führer, who, after his struggles with God, descends from the mountain as the savior to save the people, saves the individual soul that has devoted itself to serve the Grail and to construct the dome of the Reich. Medieval romanticism pours through, is thick, well-defined, and tremendously strong when it comes to Nazism. And while the anti-Semitism of the Third Reich was apparent from the outset, its paganism actually took somewhat longer to come into focus. The Norse gods, the Knights Templar, Thor and Odin, Wagner's operas, and yet Voglin helps us understand that, having fled the Anschluss. In full color, Hitler, in his pre-war rallies, which most interest us from the point of view of political religion, began and ended most of his speeches at Nuremberg or elsewhere by thundering ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, one people, one empire, and one Führer himself. And with respect to political religion, we can take each of those major points in focus. First is ein Volk. This term, the German Volk, V-O-L-K, comes to us in English through such terms as folktale, or that's all, folks. It's not racist, but it does have connotations of tribal community. The German Volk, the Austrian Volk, is the people, their history, as they derive from the blood and the soil and hills. The word suggests in the German a sort of biological communion between the man and the nature, which liberalism interrupts and threatens. So when Hitler thundered ein Volk, he meant the German people, especially as connected to their land and as united by ties of blood. And his initial objective in terms of both domestic and foreign policy was to unite all ethnic Germans into a single regime, which would be controlled by himself. This is relatively obvious with a view to his initial conquests, the Rhineland, Austria, where he was from personally, and the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. The idea was to bring all ethnic Germans together so as to create a racial community, as well as to purify it of the alien elements that were already there. If there were any black people or Asian people, they were forced to leave. And then the Jews, who outwardly may not have looked any different than the Germans, nevertheless were directly targeted for annihilation by this regime. And there's no truth whatsoever that the Holocaust was some sort of accident or that it was a series of ideas that got out of hand. No. Hitler stands up before the Reichstag in 1934 and says the aim of this government is to destroy the Jews of Europe. There was no hesitation about that. And German citizenship is still defined by blood. You can't really become a German citizen easily or effectively unless you have German ancestry. Japan, which was Hitler's ally, also works the same way. This is the blood community that really has its roots in pre-Christian Germany, going back to the ancient tribes of the Anglo-Saxons who had migrated from northern Germany and Frisia into Britain. Hitler thundered ein Reich as well. Here is a contemporary map of the Großdeutschland aus Lebensraum, the Greater Germany and its living room. The idea is that Germany will headquarter the new European empire in which all ethnic Germans will be found. There is, of course, no excuse whatsoever for the incalculable violations of the moral law by that regime. But to try to understand the psychology somewhat, and as Voglin helps explain in his essay, Germany had been surrounded by enemies. This was a political culture and a people who felt threatened on all sides, France on one side, Russia on another side, the Hungarians over here. And so many of them felt a desire for, if not revenge, exactly for hegemony, for dominance. The German people in the first half of the 20th century had this kind of neurotic feeling, I think, subliminal, that we either dominate Europe or Europe will destroy us. And so Hitler and the Nazis appealed to that as they set about a path of conquest. And the idea initially was to unite all ethnic Germans into this empire. And if deterrence had been more robust, especially with the invasion of Czechoslovakia and Poland, then Hitler might have stopped or been forced to stop there. But eventually all caution was thrown to the wind, and he would briefly become master of Europe. And then Ein Führer, one leader who will rule over this empire. Here is Hitler addressing the Reichstag soon after the passage of the Enabling Act in 1933, a legally validated, perfectly legal act that would give him total control. It very much is worth emphasizing at this point and taking store of the fact that Salazar in Portugal and even Hitler in Germany more or less took power legally. It's true that when out of power, they did rely on force or the threat of force, but they still were appointed and or elected, and laws passed by the parliament gave them total control. So the assumption to power in Europe of fascism is a little bit more subtle than Bolshevism and the storming of the Winter Palace. Laws enabled this to happen. Said another way, and per Voglin, the title page or the subtitle of the Washington Post newspaper for the last several years has been, you can finish it, "Democracy Dies in Darkness." It's the top of the newspaper, "Democracy Dies in Darkness." Well, as a matter of fact, the European democracies did not really die in darkness. They died amid a blaze of color, of songs and hymns and uniforms and banners streaming in the breeze everywhere, as these regimes imparted to their citizenry, more narrowly or racially defined, a sense of believing, of belonging, and of community that liberalism was not able to achieve, and for which the face of European man would pay an incalculable price. These are the political religions that were foremost in Voglin's mind. As different as they are, Bolshevism, communist, fascist, reactionary, and militarist, and then Nazi, racialist and paganist, actually, as different as the ideologies were, nevertheless, he found similarities in the fact that all of these movements appropriated from traditional religion, especially Christianity and the church, a sense of community, of purpose, and of calling in the world, and restyled the Great Commission, not as something that Christ gave to his apostles prior to his ascent to heaven, but as something that the Führer gives to his followers. And in that sense, you have a politics that is as strong as religion. And that is much of Voglin's thesis. The eschaton, the final theological triumph, is immanentized, meaning brought into this world rather than left to the other world. And the salvific narrative is bastardized in that sense. However, Voglin's notion of political religion is not merely an historical curiosity. It can very much help us understand conflicts today, religious kinds of politics today, secularized theological notions that impart a tremendous and unforeseen intensity to our current partisan divisions. We'll start with the left, with the Antifa movement. And here we can shed further light upon a political formation that has taken over much of Portland, as well as bedeviled our current political situation. You note the two colors here, red and black. While this squad leader probably isn't aware of this, this color scheme dates from the Spanish Civil War of the militant Spanish left. Red refers to Marxism, and black, this person may know that, refers to anarchism. So Stendhal's novel, The Red and the Black, is about the communist and the anarchist tendencies, very much still with us today. And so the Antifa movement appropriates that. I understand what they're calling for as really less interested in an anti-capitalist transformation, as in, yes, you can see from this poster, white supremacy is terrorism. And then I can't quite restrict this one. Can't see this, freedom socialist. Okay, a socialist poster. But the ideology of Antifa as it manifests itself in the United States is primarily Maoist, actually. It continues the logic of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. Voglin's essay came out before the Chinese Revolution, so it doesn't mention it. But I think it's perfectly fair to say that his logic of political religion very much applies to what came out of China through the Cultural Revolution, and maybe even more than the other examples that he provides. Maoism in China was the basis of the Cultural Revolution, in which the aging Mao Zedong, the supreme leader, unleashed the Red Guards, the youthful young people, very much the shock troops of communism upon communist party officials, functionaries, teachers, professors, people who may have given their whole careers to supporting his rule, nevertheless were attacked. What was this about? Well, Mao Zedong had failed to achieve an economic transformation in China with the Great Leap Forward of the 1950s, when all of steel production is to be doubled over the face of China, and what the Soviet Union did, we can do. Okay. Well, the Great Leap Forward failed. There was famine in the land, and it was an utter disaster. So about a decade later, Mao responds with an attempt to achieve a political or a cultural transformation. And so the Cultural Revolution in China is the basis of what we now understand as cultural Marxism, whereby systems of Western capitalist value are to be violently confronted and smashed, and in exchange, a new kind of cultural order is to be created. It's a violently intolerant cultural Marxism. Its ideas whereby the peasantry, the people, are to rise up and to destroy every intellectual vestige of the bourgeoisie are contained in the Little Red Book, which was handed out and printed en masse, containing quotations and speeches from, you guessed it, the supreme leader, from Mao Zedong, about how to be a good revolutionary. And this Little Red Book, which served as the Bible, if you will, of the Cultural Revolution, in which the idolatrous worship of Mao was taken to new heights of pagan intensity, pure political religion. The Little Red Book and the practice of the cult of the supreme leader, with his image everywhere, would be impersonated elsewhere. Pol Pot, the head of Cambodia, wrote his own Little Red Book in imitation of the Maoist version. Muammar Gaddafi, the late dictator of Libya, wrote a Little Green Book in imitation of Mao. And so what you see is that Maoism, this intense cultural Marxist, violently intolerant revolution, would proliferate through the Red Guards unleashed upon China, to the Khmer Rouge, Red Cambodia, red as in communist, the Communist Party of Cambodia that took power in 1975 and inflicted genocide. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, who attacked the Munich Olympic Games and killed the Israeli athletes. That's a Maoist group. The Shining Path in Peru, and an Antifa in the United States. This is a Maoist revolutionary doctrine, which is a very strong example of Voglin's notion of political religion. And then on the other side of the spectrum, central to the insurrection was a network called QAnon. I had heard of this before the election. I had definitely heard of it. Everyone was talking about it after the insurrection. And so wanting to find out more, I published an article about this myself, which you can read if it interests you. So I conducted some of my own research on this, and an anonymous internet user who calls himself Q, and he's anonymous, began posting things about the American federal government and about how the CIA and the intelligence community was sexually blackmailing people, especially prominent people from the elite strata of society, in order to sustain a permanent counter-revolution of devil worshipping and pedophilic activities. Right. Well, that's quite a thesis, isn't it? Well, as it turned out, one man who believed this very strongly among many within the QAnon network was Jake Angley. Real name is Chance Lee. He's in his mid-30s. And he goes to Trump rallies, and he was in the US Capitol, as you know, with his horns and his tattoos and makeup, and his spear, which was a weapon, admittedly, brought into the Capitol with an American flag tied to it. This character, who's in Arizona right now, where he's from, on trial for insurrection, he self-published a book last year, assuming Amazon hasn't taken it down. I bought it before they did, called One Mind at a Time, A Deep State of Illusion. And in this book, he unfolds his QAnon thesis that there's something called the deep state. And the deep state is basically the intelligence apparatus of civilian kind. I don't know about military intelligence, but the civilian intelligence, above all the CIA. And the CIA is full of Satanists and pedophiles. And in order to carry on these activities, the CIA sexually blackmails prominent people like Harvey Weinstein or Jeffrey Epstein or Catholic priests and so on, sexually blackmails them. And then as punishment for disobedience, they're exposed. And so that's how this reign of terror is preserved. So Chance Lee and his other QAnon followers, you saw signs, Save the Children and so on, believed that by staging the insurrection, at least in part, they were saving the children from being devoured by devil-worshipping pedophiles within the CIA. A fanciful thesis, to be sure. So how would this be described? Based on his manifesto, which is, I think, the best guide to this, I really would not describe QAnon as a right-wing movement. I would describe it as a kind of perverse libertarian movement, actually. It's anti-state. It is populist in terms of people. It's ideological. His book doesn't say anything about immigrants or people taking over or women or anti-Semitism or anything like that. It's all about the abuses of the, quote, unknown and unchecked portion of US government power. So, I mean, based on that, I would describe it as a kind of warped and deluded libertarian movement, actually, of people who clearly are deeply misinformed, but who are aggrieved and distracted and who want things to change dramatically. And so that was a part of what took place under the insurrection. Again, political religion, the sense of community and of belonging. When I was watching the footage of the insurrection, one of the things that struck me as quite suggestive was the sense of camaraderie, of community almost among those who stormed the Capitol. It was a sense of being a part of something, of having brothers and sisters around you whom you could trust, who you could believe in. They seem to be sort of one mind about this, that we are engaged in a cause that matters and that is important. I felt that to be suggestive. And that notion of a calling, of a politics of transcendent meaning, as well as, of course, of us versus them, is central to Voglin's notion of the political religion as he identified it just before World War II, but as we can now trace it very directly in some cases up until our current partisan divisions today. So, there's still much work to be done, for sure, in terms of understanding where we are politically today and how to adjust the situation. But Voglin's analysis, theoretically and historically, I think provides not new, but new old stock, as it were, very much useful food for thought as these debates continue and as the current political challenges must continue to be addressed. Thank you. Hope you've enjoyed this talk, and I look forward to your doubtless highly provocative questioning.
Okay, and we do have 25 minutes actually, just about left, so we have plenty of time for questions. Let me open up. Todd Solberg asks if you could comment on Ayn Rand and George Orwell.
Certainly. In what sort of way, what sort of angle would the questioner like to kind of narrow that down a little bit or not?
If you put another comment into the Q&A, Todd, I will pass that on. We can go on to the next one. Seymour Metz.
Or I'll take that actually.
Okay, go ahead.
Briefly, Ayn Rand and Orwell, sure. Rand was a screenwriter, Russian Jewish, found her way to the United States, novelist. One sentence version is that she is reacting to Bolshevism, to the totemization of the C word, collectivism, by kind of posturing her own idolization of the I word, the individual. Rand worships the individual just as Lenin worshipped the collective. Orwell is a maybe more complex figure. He's an aggrieved, disdainful socialist, but above all an anti-totalitarian who was more than anything concerned with how the political religion, how the total state could dominate and totally control our lives. And his novels are protesting against that. Yes, continue.
Okay, next was Seymour Metz asked whether socialism didn't have religious roots prior to Marx and Engels.
The answer is yes and no, depending on what you mean by socialism. Socialism has different meanings. It doesn't have a clear beginning. The term is used in different contexts to mean different things. The maybe best answer is that the socialism of the British Labour Party, through such characters as Tony Benn, Michael Foot, Dennis Heatley, the leaders of labor during the 20th century, that version of socialism did have Christian roots, and Benn its best exponent, is quite explicit about this. From the Puritan Revolution, the democratizing and republicanizing elements of the English Civil War, moving into the reconstitution of labor as a socialist, not as a socialist party, but as a party where socialists would be welcome, that has its origins in dissenting Christianity. So kind of Methodism, Congregationalism, the independent Calvinist movements, very much the Methodist and Free Church movements of the 17th and 18th centuries kind of evolves into the socialism of the Labor Party of the 19th century. So in that sense, yes, it did. And during the mid-20th century, Labor Party leaders, Harold Wilson, Callaghan, felt that we are building the kingdom of heaven on earth, and that God will be revealed here, and that if the Lord Jesus Christ was not a card-carrying member of the Labor Party, well, it was only because the Labor Party didn't exist in the first century in Palestine. So in that sense, there is a very robust connection. More broadly, Engels addresses that directly in his essay on the origins of Christianity, in which Engels, although atheist, he salutes the apostles and the apostolic church, actually of Peter and Paul, as this rising of the ordinary people, and that the Galileans, right, the serfs, the poor people, this is a kind of revolution, and good on them, as it were. Even though the theology isn't true, nevertheless, they were onto something there. So Engels writes that in his essay, and in that sense, there's a connection as well. But generally speaking, though, socialism is not a religious movement. It's a materialist movement. The rank and file of socialism, of socialists, do not tend to be very religious people as a whole. But I did note some of those major connections.
Okay, I'll go next to Andrew Hahn, and I'm going to condense your comment a little bit. He asked whether you could explain what fascism actually is, presumably in a way that would help him understand it a bit better. He said he tried reading an essay by Mussolini and felt it was all touchy-feely with no specifics. He says National Socialism is called fascism, but it has socialism in the name, and he says he feels like fascism describes nationalism, but that Stalinist communism seemed as nationalist to him as any of the traditional fascist political theories.
Sure. Further definitional clarification. It's tough. The essay that he's referring to there is The Political and Social Doctrine of Fascism by Benito Mussolini, which he wrote himself. That's something, and included in his autobiography. I have it downstairs, I could quote from it. But basically, fascism takes the logic of the army and applies it to the society. Obedience, uniforms, collectivism, authority, strong discipline, destruction of those who won't conform, and traditional values. Fascism is the militarization of state and society as a whole, such that literally in a fascist state, everyone's wearing a uniform, just like you do in the military. Fascism is the militarization of an entire state and society. And what goes along with that, of course, nationalism, patriotism, obedience, traditional moral values, and all the rest of it. Nazism grew out of fascism, and in 1934, you might describe it merely as that, as the National Socialist Party in Germany is just the fascist version. It became something else, though. It became a more explicitly racist empire based on the idolatrous worship of the blood cult of Germany. Now, the very name National Socialist German Workers' Party, what's basically going on there is that Hitler and Goering and those who built up the party are essentially saying that we are socialist in the sense of collective. We, the rulers of Nazi Germany, do not want our new state to be strongly divided into different social classes. We don't want to have a huge proletariat and then a money-grubbing bourgeoisie. No, we are all revolutionary comrades. We are socialist in the sense of doing away with, or at least de-emphasizing, class distinctions, although Hitler did not take away private property. So it's trying to impart a sense of national community there. So said another way, fascism, Mussolini, Hitler, Salazar, Franco, recognizes that the Marxist critique of capitalism has some truth in it, that capitalism does divide people into the rich and the poor, that the money really does go right to the top and leaves ordinary people with nothing, that under the liberal system, some very few get very rich and others stay poor, and fascism says that that isn't acceptable. A modern version of that would be Richard Spencer and the alt-right movement with its kind of anti-capitalist posture. Spencer himself has said that he dislikes capitalism. So that's where that is coming from in the main.
Next, let's go to Gloria Lowe's question, saying she'd like to understand the lure of fascism to both haves and have-nots. And is there a link to similarities today among Trump followers? Is there a value that unites them, and how much does it relate to racism?
Okay, piece by piece. Appeal of fascism to the have-nots was that suddenly you're a have. Fascism comes along and says to a semi-employed, involuntarily celibate, living at home in the basement, never amounted to anything, young man, and says to him, knocks at the door, put on this uniform and you will go downtown or out to a camp, you'll take an oath, and you will become one of the stormtroopers of the SA or the SS to bring glory to our supreme leader. It makes you into something overnight, fascism. Whereas liberalism takes years. Okay, you have to be undergrad, and then you have to earn your master's degree, and then you have to earn your doctorate, and then you have to pay off your student loans, and then you have to persuade somebody to marry you, and then you have to do all of this. No, fascism, overnight. You're somebody, you're good to go. That's the main appeal of it. Appeal to the haves is a bit more subtle, but it was basically, you'll keep your property. We're not going to take that away. But in turn, we want you to support the system. We want you to make armaments. We want you to employ people. Be a part of this. And you can speak to our Führer and so on. It included them on their own terms. Okay. Is there a link to Trump supporters? It depends on what you mean by support. Nearly half the population voted for President Trump. So that's a different question. If by supporters you mean fanatical followers who, like the insurrectionists at the Capitol, if you isolate it into them, to groups like the Proud Boys, to QAnon, to the people that stormed the building, is there a connection there? Basically, the answer is yes. He was able to speak to such people more viscerally, more emotionally than anyone in their lifetimes had. And even if they knew, as I think they probably did, that there really wasn't going to be a wall with Mexico and that Mexico wasn't going to be forced to pay for it, they just loved it that he said it, because it's how they felt. The unseen was becoming seen. The unheard was becoming heard. Is it connected to racism? The major and most militant forms of political reaction in this country do have a racial consciousness to it. But I think it's much more subtle than simply disliking, much less hating people with a different skin color. What I think it really is having a changing world forced upon them without them ever giving explicit consent for that change to have occurred. To more fully and briefly enter into the mindset of such persons, if you had said to someone during the 1980s, as recently as that America would soon be majority non-white, they would think you were crazy. And yet, now it almost is. That really is enormous demographic change and social change that will have to be processed, accommodated, understood, made use of. And the inability or refusal of the leadership of either party to really directly speak to that and help people work through it manifests itself in the politics of violent reaction.
Okay, we do have about a little less than 10 minutes now left, so let's try and get through a couple more of these. Seymour Metz asked what your thoughts are on Eric Hoffer's thesis of the true believer.
Mm-hmm.
That's it for the question.
Okay, I've not read Hoffer, so actually I shouldn't comment on it.
Okay, that's a fair answer. There is some couple of questions here about how a group like QAnon gains any sort of traction, since it seems so utterly bizarre, its theory.
Yeah. When I wrote a paper about it, I answered that question myself to the best I could. I think loneliness has a lot to do with it. I think people are lonely. I think they're trapped in little air-conditioned boxes in which community is not physical, organic. It's mediated through an electronic screen. People are isolated, they're atomized, and yet at the same time they're wired. So they manifest themselves, their sense of belonging, we are social creatures, their desire to be a part of something kind of finds whatever path it can. It's the same, I think it's much the same reason why something as bizarre to previous generations as finding a wife or a husband by filling out an elaborate application and entering into this huge virtual platform or kind of iterated game in these dating websites, why something seemingly as odd as that takes control. Well, it's because people feel they're left with no choice. So the need, not the desire, the need for community will find whatever path it can. And currently those paths are virtual and they tend to flow toward the more extreme and edgy parts of the social ecosystem.
We have a couple of questions about where the term Antifa came from. Typical asking, wasn't Antifa created by far-right conservatives as a name for leftists and progressives?
No, it was not. There may have been some movement in that direction via Fox or right-wing media, but Antifa just means anti-fascist. I don't know who first employed the term, but the concept, the iconography, and certainly the ideas have been going back through the 20th century as we've seen. So categorically, no, the right-wing media did not create Antifa as some sort of straw man to argue or posture against. It has its own independent and authentic ideological basis, its own orthodoxy and orthopraxis.
Let's go to skip to the end because this is a good question. Raphael Marin asks how you would characterize the predominant political religion in the U.S. today, and do you think it's evolving to some particular direction?
Oh, predominant. Well, I think the great problem is that there is nothing predominant anymore. There is no dominant narrative. That is another way of getting at the fundamental problem of why our political and social system has become so divided, vociferous, angry, is that there is no dominant narrative. There are fewer agreed upon values. It's just sort of every man, woman, person for him, her, themselves. Whereas for most of our history, that dominant narrative had been a blend of things. It was Protestant Christianity of an Episcopal or Calvinist form. It was the civil religion of Emerson, of public television. It was a sense of the importance of democracy. It was anti-communism. It was a sense of providing a fundamental basis for the rest of human civilization during the Cold War. But now much of this is open to question. And so what we see out there today within the social fabric is lots of little political religions. There isn't much of a whole system. So you have QAnon over here, Antifa over here, evangelical homeschool families over there. You have GLBT over there, etc. All of these different little groups with typically strong walls around them, very intense barriers to entry, such that really the idea of sort of walking down the street and making friends has become just almost obsolete. Because what remains is all of these little cells with their own political theology, their own political religion, with kind of walls around them. And that certainly does not augur well for the restoration and reconstitution of functioning democratic politics.
That actually gets to the second part of his question, which was whether you think it's possible to reconcile or unify those fractured political religions without recourse to authoritarianism.
That is the question of the hour. And the fate of the Republic will be decided upon it. Yes, I do think it is possible, with a necessary, though not sufficient condition, being a real revolution in how we treat one another in the political and social fabric. The country cannot be saved if we do not stop insulting one another, mocking and ridiculing and disparaging each other. From social media, broadcast media, the political system in the Congress, the whole basis of it is insult, raillery, contempt, derision, in which the other person is just made mincemeat of. Their weaknesses, their sins, their mental health, their physical characteristics are just all mocked in front of millions of people. That absolutely must cease in order for the Republic to be saved. A revolution in how we treat one another is a necessary, although not sufficient, condition for national renewal.
Okay, I think let's pick up one more. Try and find a good one in the 1 minute we have remaining. Let's go with Karen Kinnard asks what you think Biden is doing well that could help improve the political situation in the US.
Well, what he's currently doing well is just not engaging in the kind of provocative behavior of his predecessor. Being civil, kind, and just normal over social and broadcast media. You can often succeed politically by simply just not doing something or not being someone else. So just enjoying his honeymoon is the first step. I do think the problems, though, run deeper.
Okay, that's a good answer. And we are at the end of our time. I know there are quite a few questions that weren't answered. I will do my best to collect those and pass them on to Professor Royce.
All right.
And
Delighted.
thank you, first of all, Professor Royce, for a wonderful presentation, and also to all our guests. For the AARP guests, this lecture is one of many that Ollie Mason members have access to through their membership benefits. If you want to learn more about that, please visit Ollie Mason's website at ollie.gmu.edu. So thanks very much.